Okay, and you're live.
Well, good morning, good afternoon. I'm Jack Rudloe. I'm the president of Gulf Specimen Marine Laboratory in Panacea, Florida. And today we're going to be talking about mollusks, mostly seashells. We're going to leave out the soft-bodied, squishy mollusks like the octopuses and squids and the sea slugs and sea hares and all that stuff. So we're talking about the hard-shelled mollusks. And this little collection, most of this came from a fishery for these. This is called the calico scallop. And this is what makes up one of the biggest fisheries there is. And it used to be out in the Gulf here that there were just millions and millions of calico scallops. And they're cute little pretty little things. And except that they got so thick and so deep that there were bottoms out in 80 to 100 feet of water off the Florida Panhandle, where it was 8 feet deep when divers went down of just pure scallops massed down in there. And so they would send these big boats, actually reconverted shrimp boats, and they would take the shrimp boats and put on big nets, and they would go out like 24 hours running offshore, and they could just make 2 or 3 drags, scoop it up and catch everything on the bottom, and then they would just turn around and bring it all in, the bycatch and everything else like that, and it had all kinds of skates and rays and fish and flounders and starfish and sea urchins and just everything, in fact way too much of everything. And they would bring that into Carabel or to Appalach, and they had these conveyor belts which would unload the boats, and they would go into a steamer, steam the scallops that were there, and they would have people picking out the garbage, as they called it, on the conveyor belts, and a lot of that, and then the machines would shuck the meat out, so they would have scallop meat, and then they'd have the waste of all these shells and the waste of everything. So there were some monster things caught, like this is the horse conch, and believe it or not, this is kind of average size, but there were some much bigger. We had a great big monster one that apparently took off feet and walked away by somebody or other. But anyway, things like the Junonia, which are very rare shells normally. So people found 1 or 2 of these in a lifetime, it was a big deal. But when they got out to the scallop things, there were just hundreds of them. And then some of the other great treasures that were out there were things like the lion's paw scallops. This is all stuff that you find out in deep water. So this is the insignia of the Shell Oil Company, and it's a beautiful scallop that has, sort of bright red mantle in there, and the shell is vibrantly red. So this guy's been around for a while and dried out, but they have the knuckles, and the ones that were in perfect condition were worth quite a bit of money. So that was considered of great value to the collectors and to people that get shells. But the thing about seashells is that these have been traded by people. We think they're really neat, something like this. Well, something like this would pick up, or the left-handed whelk, which I'll talk about in a second, was found in Indian middens all the way up to Ohio and maybe even further north of that, because there would be trade routes. So they would send traders down here to bring in flint, minerals, and copper and ore and other things, and the locals around here would trade seashells and smoked mullet and other things, but seashells particularly, and there were clam shells that were, don't have any of the Mercenaria clams, but anyway, they would get into the oysters. And then you want about a portable food source, look at these oysters, and consider the size of what these oysters could grow to. That would be a meal in itself. So you could just throw it into a canoe or pack it in something, and you've got food on the hook, staying alive for days, weeks sometimes, and it would still be there where you could shuck it open and eat it, and you got a very rich, delicious source of protein that was there in one big fell swoop. So this was easy to do. So they had conchs, they had clams. This is a cockle that would, a shell of a cockle that was there. And all the others, the tulip shells. Now what's interesting, just looking at some of this stuff, this is the door that the snail uses to close the door with. This isn't the exact match, but in other words, if this is a live snail, it would close up and it would leave this horny skeleton to seal up the rest of the snail. And of course, when it dies, these things will just fall off and disappear. So just looking at some of the weird stuff, let's look at this pen shell. That gets offshore in deep water as well. And all these other shells are made up of pure calcium carbonate. Except this guy. This guy has calcium carbonate in him. You see he's leaking some other little things hanging on him. But anyway, this shell is made out of a protein lattice. So it will deteriorate. But people have used this thing in places like the University of Florida Medical School and in Israel to use as potential bone grafts or for bone material to assemble on this, and it tends to dissolve after the bones, after our own natural human bones can grow onto this. So this was a project that they were working on and have from time to time, and whether they're doing plastics or what else now, who knows. We do a lot of things that just start with something and people experiment with it and it goes for a while and then it kind of all ends up. But that's what's kept Gulf Specimen going for a long time. And then there's other interesting things. Now look at this. This is one hell of a collection of baby ears or ear shells. And what these things are really extraordinary. Some of them have holes in them, so somebody bored holes into them. But these guys, basically, this shell is almost internal inside this white, sluggy looking thing. Looks like a piece of white pork that is full of mucus, and it slides around just beneath the sand, making trails. And what's really interesting about these ear shells is that the mucus and the mucigens that come out of this thing have really strong healing properties. So if your hands are kind of shredded out and dried out with formaldehyde, or nowadays within virus time with all the hand cleaners that are there that take away your oil, if you take a nice good slimy ear shell and you rub it in your hands like that, your fingers will feel much better about it and will heal up faster. So those are just some of the stories that we see. This big guy, this is the helmet shell, and it has a name of Cassius madagascarensis. And whether it was found in Madagascar or not, or someone thought it came from Madagascar, most of these are around in the western Atlantic. They may get into the Indian Ocean. I've heard one or two references of it, but this is where the scallop boats would drag this up. And what do these guys eat? They love to eat sand dollars and sea urchins. So they can climb around, they come out of the sand, they stay mostly buried, they come out, this big thing slides around like that, which is high speed for a snail shell, and then it seizes its prey, which is a sand dollar or a sea biscuit, and it eats it and sucks all the juices and proteins out of it and leaves the empty shell behind. So he's another predator. Now let's talk about, speaking of predators, okay, so this and this is the horse conch, Chlorploca gigantea. This is essentially the great white shark of snails. Now, snails, conchs eat each other all the time. So one eats the other, and then they also will stop and have a clam dinner. But what's interesting is this gun will eat the left-handed whelk, and the left end it will eat the clown conchs as well, and it would probably eat the Genonias if it found it, because it will sit there and smother, and it has this radula, which is this set of grinding little teeth, a ribbon of teeth, it's kind of like an escalator that comes out, chews through the shell, bores a hole into it, sucks the meat out, and kills it, and also suffocates the snail, so eventually it comes out of the shell, and then it devours the snail, digests it away, and leaves the empty shell behind, which is a great thing for a hermit crab that'll move into it and say hooray. So that's one that's interesting. Now what I wanted to show you, again, here's a small left-handed whelk, but this will demonstrate it. Why do we call this the left-handed whelk? Because it has a left-handed rotation. It goes this way, as opposed to right-handed rotations. which go that way, which most of the snails in the world are right-handed, but there's a very small group of them which are left-handed rotations. And in the Buddhist cultures, the left-handed snails were considered very sacred and valuable. So for a long time there was a fishery here that were shipping these things over to Thailand and Burma and other places like that. So why, people ask me, why does the Gulf have the predominant snail here why are there so many here? So I give them a smart-ass answer, which basically says, well, back in the TK boundary between the end of the Mesozoic, when the dinosaurs became extinct, the great big asteroid came in, smashed into the Gulf, and spun these snails backwards. That's as good an answer as any, or as bad an answer as it is. But I've also learned that don't say that too seriously, because people will start taking it seriously and saying, well, this is the way it is. The answer is, I have no idea why there are left-handed whelks here in such numbers. Some of the other extraordinary and interesting things that we can find are the shipworms. Okay. Now, this is not a snail, it is a clam. And this clam bores into the wood and makes these holes, and here's its tube. It has a lime tube. And this little fleshy, it's a little round clam with a long body with little, essentially feelers that reach up, and that's what catches the plankton in it. But they bore the holes into the wood, and they devour the wood, essentially, and the wood breaks down, and then it becomes covered with bacteria, and then shrimp and crabs and other things eat it. So these are very, very important in growing habitats. It's called woodfall. So when a tree falls into the river or driftwood and it washes out into the sea and it sinks down into the depths, that's when the shipworms grow on it. Also, it can happen in the shore, like with oysters. All right, this is the same oyster as this, but these are called coon oysters. And they're called coon oysters, I guess, because the raccoons like to feed on them. This one has a mussel in it, by the way, this little guy here. But the reason they're clumped together is they had larvae that were all settled and crowded each other out. And then these are covered and uncovered by the tides on a very daily basis. So consequently, this one, say, would be at the foot of our dock up at the edge of the marsh, and it would grow and stay alive for a long, long time, maybe 20 years. We kind of guesstimated on some of these things. And these are producing the sperm and the egg and the larvae, which are necessary to help the other oysters grow out there and recruit it. So what happens with the shipworms is this oyster larvae would settle and grow on this wood, and then the worms, the clam worms, or the shipworms that are in here, would eat the wood up, and it dissolves, and the oysters would fall down to the bottom. And it's kind of my conjecture or thesis or whatever, or idea, is that maybe a lot of the great big Apalachicola bars that were created, that have been there, may have come from log jams. Back in the 1850s, there was a massive amount of sawmills stripping the timber out from the whole region that had been going on for almost like 50 years. And they had cut the trees and had sawmills going left and right, and they had lumber ships coming in and getting the lumber and shipping it out, and it was a vigorous trade. And then comes the hurricane of 1850, which smashes all the things together, and it floods the place, and it takes all the logs that were there, throws it out into the channel, into Apalachicola Bay, which is almost landlocked. It has very little openings except for West Pass and East Pass, and this was even before they chopped through New Cut. And basically it would stay in there, and the wood would soak up and rot and sink to the bottom. The oyster larvae that was there, and there were natural oyster bars, would grow on it, and then the shipworms would eat up the wood, so all traces of that over the next 100 years or so of any wood would be gone. But the actual oyster bars that fed people for so long would be living. And this would become from basically planting oysters on trees, which is a project that I would really love to see. I think that could be the answer to replenishing our oyster supplies by just simply taking the brush that comes down from hurricanes and trees that are fallen and loading them up and finding places to put them out there in big windrows and chaining them down or whatever it would take to keep them from all drifting off all over the place, and then letting the oysters grow on them and the shipworms to metabolize it. So in both cases, our wonderful friends, the mollusks, have been feeding us and have been doing things. So all of these creatures are, look at the diversity that people love. I mean, take this. This is this gorgeous shell, the angel wing clam. Well, if you've ever seen a real angel wing clam, you see it like this, and it is beautiful. It does look like the angel wing. But this is probably one of the most god-awful, ugliest looking things that you're ever going to find. So if you walk along the tide flat, all you will see is this hole and this pink, phallic-looking thing sticking up from it. And if you dig down, and sometimes you have to dig all the way down to your arm to get down underneath it, and you pull this muddy, slimy thing up that's spurting water, it doesn't look appetizing. But when it dies and this washes off, it has this gorgeous angel wing. So it's sort of like an epiphany of itself, or a creation. So other things that are of interest, yeah, see, we have a lot to talk about here, is the, we'll get to him, all right, is the tulip shell. Okay, now, the tulip shell is found in grass beds and in shallow areas, and they really have, some of them have really beautiful shells. This is the, this is Fasciolaria tulipa, and that gets to be the big one, and the little bright colored one, which I don't think we have one here right now, is Fasciolaria hunteria. But it doesn't matter, this is the one that's really the great white shark and the terror of scallops. So if we have the scallop over here, and he's sitting here minding his own business on the flats, so he's got his bright blue eyes up there, and he moves around a little bit with little hops. But along comes this guy, and when this guy gets in range and gets close, he goes hop, 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 and runs away as fast as he can. And it's really a hoot to watch that happening. It's a lot of fun. Now, so who? Oh yeah, Strombus. We'll get to him too. Okay, so this is the the Strombus is the related to the queen conch. These are fighting conchs, and they're called fighting conchs because they have this their foot in there, which if you pick it up, it will jump and try to jump out of your hand and send this thing jumping away, and that's how it moves like that. So it's this is very abundant, but it's also related to the queen conchs that are found out in the Keys and down in the Bahamas, and that's the conch that everybody loves to eat. It's a very tender, sweet meat, and that's because it's a total vegetarian. These guys are vegetarians partly, but they're also predators, so they're not quite as tender and tough. And even though there are at times millions of these things out there, there isn't really that much meat on them. So we'll keep getting, and here's a murex. This is the apple murex, and this also is a boring one. So if you find a clam with a hole bored in it on the beach, or another snail, it could very well be like this guy that has a little drill that chews its way right on through the calcium carbonate and gets into it and eats it. And so they're also related to oyster drills. Now, this is interesting. This is the western scallop. And I don't know, maybe there's one or two over here in the eastern Gulf, but I'm not sure I've ever seen one. But I know that as soon as you cross the Mississippi River and you drop a shrimp net out in certain places, there will be lots of these scallops. And this is very similar to what they make the northern scallops out of, that are bigger things that have a nice big chunk of meat that people will often think is, at least there's a rumor that it's supposed to be skate wings or stingrays. That may have happened. In fact, in all my history of eating at lots of seafood restaurants, I've only once had stingray wings being called scallops. And I mentioned that to the waiter, and he said that was not the case. So I explained to him that true scallops, the meat goes up and down, and in the case of stingrays, it's sideways, and it didn't quite taste as wonderful as the scallop does. So finally, who else haven't we talked to? We've talked about the spondylus here. These are found on, you can find them on deep sea oil rigs. They're very beautiful, very fragile. They attach to something, and people just find them this way, and they are considered a great thing of beauty, and they're much prized by shell collectors. Now the other thing I want to talk about really here, and I think we're about to wrap it up, is this. Okay, this is a battered up, beaten up shell, but look at all the little holes in it. What do you think made these holes? Well, actually what made these holes is a sponge, and it's called a boring sponge. So it settled on this shell, and it bored in all these little holes, and the shell breaks down. It turns into first it would bore in there, and then this whole thing would turn yellow from the sponge, and then you might actually see the sponge grow up till it looks like a tower, and it can be that tall, but it all begins growing on a shell like this and eating the shell up. That's why these seashells don't last forever. They're in the water, and then they kind of disappear. Now, speaking of disappearing, over the years we have seen less and less seashells. Famous places like Sanibel Island that had so many seashells that people would just come for that whole reasons to walk the beaches and pick up a great many of these things have all but vanished. In fact, Sanibel was such a rich shelling area around the Sarasota area that people would, hotels on the East Coast where they didn't have them would send truckloads over to load it up with shells and drive over to their beaches and throw the shells out so their tourists could find seashells. Again, why? Because we gravitate towards these things. But what we should really be looking at is, why has the water quality gone to hell? Why do we have so many red tides? Why do we have poisonous algae and microalgae that are in there, and flesh-eating bacteria, and all the other poisons and pollutants that are coming from our industry, from our development, from our blind lack of appreciation for all of this? People have split minds. They love the seashells, they love the coast, they love everything else like that, and they continue to mess it up. Well, we can't continue to let that happen. So I'm talking not to the people that did this, I'm talking to the youth and the young people that are coming up. It's time to bring this stuff back, and it's time to put the brakes on the type of things that have pushed this away. So I want to thank you today for coming here and joining me and talking about the wonderful world of seashells that we have. And
we have a couple of questions. Wait.
Okay, questions, right.
Okay, so Bridget asks, what mollusks are unique to North Florida?
Unique to North Florida. I can't really think of any that don't get up to the, say, North Carolina or down into Brazil. Virtually all of these things do. I mean, you know, I have been off Suriname, and I have been off Costa Rica, and I have found many and most of these things here. That what I would say is specifically unique to Florida. This is one of our predominant shells, and I think it's the state shell, but I don't think there's anything here because we're all connected to a nice ocean, and it gets around, and as long as we have a healthy environment. We have, I forgot one, moon snail, right, while we're here. So this guy creeps along the bottom. He looks like a fried egg. All you see is this and this big shell that's around it. And, you know, that's what's there, and he's part of it. Oops, let me shove this off. Right.
Can you talk a little bit about the seashell landfill?
Oh, yeah, right. Well, okay, during the scallop heyday, when there were just tons and tons of scallops that were being brought in, they would pick out, you know, the meat and the shell and everything else, load it in dump trucks, carry it up to dumps in Carabel and other places out in the woods, and just pile it up.
Were they alive?
Yeah, a lot of times they were alive. So a lot of times I would actually go through those things, and we would try to pick them up, and if they hadn't been out in the sun too long, we could even bring some back and keep them alive. But those are all eaten up and gone and broken down. And frankly, I'm very glad to see that kind of wasteful fishery come to an end.
How come it ended?
How come it ended? They fished them out. You know, like the oysters in Alice in Wonderland. An oyster came there, answer came there none because they'd eaten every one, and similar types of things. But why haven't they reoccurred, and why haven't we had scallops coming back to us? I have no idea. I mean, there's changes, things. Why have so many of these things diminished in numbers or disappeared entirely? The water has changed, things have happened, and we've had ugly oil spills and things that have done bad things to our environment, and nature is beginning to back up. And one of the backups probably was the reduction of the calico scallop fishery.
Seidler asks, any poisonous or venomous cone shells in Florida?
Yes, there indeed are. Do we have a cone snail?
I don't know, is this one?
Nope. Okay.
I don't think we have it.
Leaf club. We do get them, by the way. All the cone snails are venomous. It's just that but they don't really hurt anybody because they're very reluctant to do anything and send their proboscis into it. But unlike the Conus geographicus that you find in the Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific and the eastern countries, this is a beautiful shell that is a very light shell but intricate colors, and everybody would want to pick this thing up, except it has a dart that it shoots off into your hand, injects a horrible peptide poison, and you die horribly, and you can't breathe, and your heart stops eventually, and then there's nothing that they can do for you except ask you who you want to leave your estate to.
Have you ever got bit by one?
Hell no. I picked them up, but I've been very careful. When I was on the Indian Ocean expedition in Madagascar, I brought several back, but I was extremely careful because I knew what to look for. And no, I have never been stuck by one.
Oh.
The only thing I've ever been stuck by or ever had a problem with is the big tridacna clams. And I was stupid enough to try to reach in and grab a shrimp that was inside when I was collecting for the Smithsonian Institute, and it closed on my hand, and I had a hard time and almost drowned. But people were able to break it loose and lift it up and then cut it out, and I was in the doghouse for a long time, plus a rather chewed up hand. But,
What clam was it again?
It's called a tridacna. It's the big giant clam of the Pacific. If it was one of those great big ones, I would not be here. But it was one about this size, and it was anchored on the bottom, and I dove down to grab the little, beautiful little spotted shrimp that was inside of it, and then there it was. So that's my worst thing. Although, if you get pinched by one of these things on Alligator Point, and you pick up a fresh one and you stick your finger in there, you won't like it. You'll feel like it's getting it may chop your finger off. It's really a powerful thing.
Okay, can you talk a little bit about this shell?
Oh, the tonas. Tonas are, yeah, you find these things in mostly deep water, and they're also very much like the helmet shell. They kind of prowl along the bottom, and they eat, I think they eat much the same thing, starfish and that sort of thing. And actually, they're good to eat. I've eaten one or two of these things over the years, but I've tried to eat most of these things. And they're also a big predator. And then we didn't talk about the murex here. Oh, this is the eastern murex, and he's a beautiful spiky shell. But again, he's a ferocious beast that if he were to come on this guy even, he would bore into his shell and kill him and eat him. So nature is wonderful.
Interesting. Well, okay, I think that's it for now.
All right, well, thank you all for watching and for checking in.